The night was quiet and cold, and the forest was deep and wide, and filled with fog as far as the eye could see. The trees stood tall like giants, and their shadows moved slowly with the wind. In the middle of this silent world walked a young man named Jake, who wore a soldier uniform and carried a small flashlight in his hand. His boots made soft sounds on the wet leaves. But there was something strange about this night that made his heart beat faster. The radio on his shoulder gave out static and then went quiet, and Jake stopped walking and looked around with alert eyes. He whispered hello into the radio, but there was no answer, only silence and the sound of distant birds flying away. Jake moved deeper into the fog, and his flashlight caught something shiny on the ground. He bent down and saw a footprint, but it was not human, and it was glowing softly with blue light. His breath became heavy, and he looked left and right, trying to understand what he was seeing. He touched the print, and it felt warm, as if something had just passed from there. He stood up and pointed his light forward, but the fog was too thick and his vision blurred suddenly. He heard a sound, a soft growl, low and steady like something watching from the dark. Jake turned quickly and raised his weapon, his finger ready on the trigger. But nothing moved, and only the mist danced around him. Then he saw a shape tall and slender moving slowly between the trees. It did not look human. Its body shimmered like glass under moonlight, and its hair flowed like black fire. Jake took a step back and then another, but the figure moved closer without a sound. His heart raced, and he wanted to run, but his legs felt frozen. The figure stopped a few steps away. Now Jake could see her face. She was beautiful but not human. Her skin was silver with light blue lines running across her cheeks and neck. Her eyes were large and glowing like stars, and they looked deep into Jake as if reading his thoughts. She tilted her head slowly and blinked once. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The air around her was strange, heavy and electric. Like lightning before a storm, the alien woman stepped forward, and Jake stepped back. He slipped on a rock and fell. On the ground, the flashlight rolled away, and the world turned dark except for the glow from her skin. She walked toward him slowly and kneeled beside him. Jake tried to push back, but her hand touched his chest gently, and he stopped moving. Her touch was warm and calm. His fear slowly faded like smoke in the air. She looked into his eyes and spoke. Her voice was soft and deep, not in English but full of meaning. Jake could not understand the words, but he felt their weight. She said something again, and then touched his forehead with 2 fingers. Suddenly Jake's head felt light, and his eyes closed on their own. The last thing he saw was her face looking down at him with something like sadness or curiosity, or both. Time passed, and the fog stayed thick and quiet. Birds stopped singing, and the wind held its breath. The night kept its secrets hidden in the mist. And deep inside the forest, in a cave hidden by rocks and vines, Jake lay still on a soft surface made of glowing alien fabric. His eyes opened slowly, and he saw strange shapes on the walls, lines that moved and changed like they were alive. He sat up and looked around. The cave was warm and filled with soft light. He saw his gear on the side, and his gun was gone. He tried to stand, but his legs were weak. Then he heard a sound, a whisper, like wind through leaves. He turned his head and saw her again. The same alien woman, standing near the entrance of the cave, watching him with those glowing eyes. She stepped forward, and Jake stayed still. She did not speak. She only looked at him with something in her eyes that was not anger, not fear, not even kindness. It was something deeper, something old and wild and powerful. Jake felt the weight of her gaze like a storm pressing on his chest. He opened his mouth again, but she raised one hand and he stopped. She came closer and sat near him. Her body moved with grace like water. And for a moment, the cave was silent again. Only the sound of 2 heartbeats filled the air, one human, one not. But somehow in rhythm. Jake sat in the corner of the glowing cave, and his eyes slowly adjusted to the soft light that moved like water on the walls. His hands rested on his knees, and his mind felt heavy like it had been swimming in a deep sea. Across from him stood the alien woman, her tall frame calm and silent like a mountain under the stars. Her silver skin caught the glow of the cave, and her eyes watched him with no clear emotion. Just endless curiosity and control. She moved without sound, her bare feet touching the ground like feathers, and her long dark hair flowing behind her like shadow. Jake tried to speak again, but his throat felt dry, and his words stuck in his mouth like stones. He looked at her and pointed at himself, then spoke slowly with care and confusion. "My name is Jake." She tilted her head just slightly, and her glowing eyes blinked once, then twice. Jake pointed at her and said softly, "You, who are you?" She said nothing, and then took a small step forward with grace that felt almost unreal. Her hand lifted slowly, and she pointed at her chest and said one word, "Zara." Jake repeated the name, and she nodded once, and her eyes narrowed as if she was trying to read the sounds in his voice. They sat in silence for a long moment, and the cave around them hummed gently like it was alive with some secret power. Jake looked down at his hand and then noticed the faint blue mark glowing on his skin. It looked like a symbol, or maybe a signature written in light. He touched it and felt a small pulse like a second heartbeat. Zara watched him carefully and then reached forward with one hand and touched the same mark. Jake froze as her fingers brushed his skin, and the glow from the mark brightened for a moment and then faded again. She pulled her hand back, and her eyes changed for the first time since he had seen her. They looked softer now, and something in them felt almost human. She spoke again in her strange, soft language and placed her hand over her chest, then reached out and placed it gently on Jake's chest. The gesture was slow and delicate, and Jake felt his heartbeat echo under her touch. Then she leaned back and drew a small device from the side of the cave and pressed it gently. A small beam of light opened from the wall and showed floating symbols and images in the air. Jake watched as the images formed planets and creatures, and one of them looked very much like him. Floating image showed a human man standing next to a tall alien woman just like Zara. Jake realized this was not a chance meeting. This was something planned or expected by someone. His mind filled with questions, but his voice was quiet and his body still unsure. Zara turned to the image and touched one of the lights, and it shifted to show a starship falling through space and crashing on a green planet, Earth. Jake now understood she was not here by choice. She had fallen here alone and hunted. Suddenly a loud sound echoed outside the cave like a roar, but not from any animal Jake had ever known. Zara's eyes widened, and she stood fast and pulled Jake up with surprising strength. She moved it to the mouth of the cave and looked out through a crack in the rocks. Jake followed and peered through the foggy gap. The mist outside was thicker than before, and shapes moved in it. Tall, strange beasts with long legs and glowing eyes crept slowly through the trees. They were sniffing the air and moving in a pattern like hunters. Zara turned quickly and pressed her fingers to the wall. The cave dimmed, and the entrance seemed to vanish as if it had never existed. Jake gasped and stepped back, but Zara held him gently and pulled him down to sit beside her. She whispered something again, soft words, full of warning and promise. Her body stayed still, and her eyes locked onto the wall as if watching beyond it. Creatures moved past the cave slowly, unaware of the two living souls hidden inside. Jake felt Zara's hand tighten around his arm. And in that moment he realized she was not just protecting herself. She was protecting him too, not out of duty or fear, but out of something else. Something that lived deep inside her, like a fire under the surface. As the sounds outside faded, Zara relaxed her grip and looked at Jake again. He looked back into her strange, beautiful eyes, and for a moment there was peace. Not of words, not of understanding, but of something stronger. The beginning of trusting the silence of the cave with danger still near and answers far away. Jake and Zara sat together, human and alien, two beings from different worlds, bound by something neither of them could explain, but both of them could feel. The cave was quiet and warm, and the silence wrapped around Jake like a blanket made of strange air. He sat close to the glowing wall with his back resting against some stone and his eyes fixed on Zara, who stood beside a silver panel carved into the rock. Her fingers moved slowly across the surface, and the light followed her touch like water follows the moon. Symbols lit up in blue and green. Jake watched them change and shift into shapes that felt familiar but unknown. His heart beat. Steady now, but each sound from the wall made him feel like something was waking up around them. Zara looked over her shoulder, and her eyes met his, and for the first time, she gave a small nod like a signal of understanding. She turned back and pressed her hand to the center of the panel, and a soft hum filled the air like the breath of a sleeping giant. Jake leaned forward and saw the wall ripple like a mirror touched by wind, and then it opened into a small hallway. Made of light, Zara stepped inside and turned her head just enough for Jake to follow. He stood slowly and walked behind her, feeling the ground change beneath his feet, from stone to something soft and smooth. Hallway opened into a chamber full of strange machines and floating lights, and the air smelled sweet like rain on metal. In the center stood a tall crystal with energy moving inside like fire. Caught in glass, Zara walked to it and placed her hand gently on its surface and spoke a word that sounded like a whisper. Wrapped in thunder, the crystal responded with a soft chime, and the machines around them came to life one by one, lighting up the chamber. Like a sky full of stars, Jake walked slowly around the crystal and looked at the machines with wide eyes and wonder in his chest. One screen showed images of Earth and other distant planets, and one of them showed Zara's ship crashing through a red sky. He pointed at the screen and said the word Earth, and Zara looked at him and nodded again. She pointed at another image of two figures standing side by side, one human and one alien, their hands touching, their eyes glowing, and their hearts marked with the same light. Jake looked at his hand and the glowing mark that still pulsed gently like a second heartbeat. He touched it, and then looked at Zara, who now stood very still with her eyes on the crystal. She whispered something and placed both hands on the surface, and the room grew quiet again. A beam of light shot from the top of the crystal and formed a ring of symbols in the air, and they slowly turned like a map written in the sky. Jake watched the symbols shift, and one of them turned red and blinked. He stepped closer and looked at Zara, who stared at the red symbol with a face that had changed. Now her calm expression had faded into something colder, something deeper, something like fear held behind strong eyes. The red symbol blinked faster, and the machines gave a low warning sound. Zara turned to Jake and spoke slowly in broken English. "They come." Jake stepped back with confusion in his eyes and asked who and why. Zara took a moment to search for the right words, then said, "Hunters, find me, kill child." Jake stood silent as her words echoed in his mind like thunder rolling through empty fields. He looked at her and shook his head and said, "What child?" Zara looked down and placed her hand on her stomach, and the light from the crystal reflected on her skin, and Jake understood before she could speak again. He stared at her and stepped closer and said, "Mine." Zara looked into his eyes and said, "Ours." The silence between them was louder than any storm, and Jake felt the ground shift beneath his feet as if the truth itself had weight. Zara stepped forward and took his hand, and the mark on both of them began to glow brighter than before. The machines responded to their connection, and the crystal pulsed with energy like a heartbeat. Too big to be human, a loud sound broke the moment like glass shattering under pressure, and the chamber lights flickered as if something outside had touched the cave. Zara ran to a screen and touched it quickly, and a view from above the forest appeared, showing a dark ship entering the sky from the clouds. Jake saw it and knew this was not a rescue. This was not help. This was danger. Zara pressed another button, and the hallway closed behind them, sealing the crystal chamber in silence again. She turned to Jake and spoke with firm voice, "We run." He nodded and grabbed his small pack and followed her back through the light path into the first cave. Mist outside had thickened, and the wind howled through the trees like voices searching for something lost. Zara stepped out first and scanned the area, then waved for Jake to follow, and together they moved into the fog with nothing but light on their hands and fire in their hearts. Behind them the cave faded into the rocks, once again hiding its secrets from the sky. Above them the ship moved lower, and its shadow crawled over the forest like a beast smelling blood. The forest stretched wide and endless, and every shadow seemed alive as Jake and Zara ran through the thick mist with their feet pressing deep into the soft, wet ground. The trees around them whispered, like old spirits watching their escape, and every branch felt like a hand reaching out to stop them. Above, the sky was dark and heavy, and the ship that hunted them moved like a silent bird with metal wings and glowing eyes Jake kept his eyes on. Zara, who ran ahead with grace that felt more like wind than muscle. Her movements were fast, but her hand always stayed close to his in case he tripped or lost the path. They reached a broken road hidden under roots and vines and followed it deeper into the forest, where a long-abandoned Earth military station waited in silence. The door was half open, and rust covered the walls like old blood, but it was shelter, and they needed shelter now more than ever. Inside, the air was thick and dry, and machines sat broken like skeletons of another time. Jake searched the room for anything useful, while Zara stood still with one hand on her stomach and her breath slow and deep. He looked at her and saw her shoulders tremble and her eyes close for a second too long. He walked to her side and placed his hand gently on her back and asked, "What is wrong?" Zara looked at him, and her voice was soft and full of something new, something deep. She said, "Life is inside me." Jake stood silent, and his mind tried to hold the meaning of her words. He placed his hand over hers and felt the warmth beneath her skin, and in that moment, everything changed. His past, his mission, his fear, all faded like morning fog, and only one truth remained: she was carrying life, their life. Zara turned toward a small table and opened a panel on the wall, revealing a scanner made for alien biology. She placed her hand on it, and the screen lit up with a soft hum. Jake watched as a shape appeared slowly, a small form moving gently in a circle surrounded by glowing energy. Zara looked at the screen with wide eyes, and Jake saw a single tear slide down her cheek, not from fear, but from something deeper than words. He reached out and touched the screen where the small form floated and whispered, "That is our child." Zara nodded and placed her hand over his, and their marks glowed bright again with the same light as the screen. The scanner began to beep faster, and Zara stepped back with a wince as pain moved through her side. Jake grabbed a piece of cloth from his bag and made a seat for her and helped her sit down slowly. Outside the station, the sound of engines grew louder, and the shadows moved across the windows like smoke with purpose. Jake turned to the door and pulled it shut, then activated the old lock system and watched the metal bars slide into place with a heavy sound. He turned back and saw Zara leaning back with her eyes closed and her hand gripping the edge of the table. She whispered something in her language and then spoke in broken English, not normal child, hybrid power and blood. They come to end before it begins. Jake clenched his fists and felt anger burn in his chest like fire rising through dry wood. He walked to the back wall where old weapons were stored and found one that still had charge. He checked the cells and the screen blinked green and ready. He turned to Zara and said, "I protect you. I protect our child." No matter what. Zara opened her eyes and looked at him, not with fear but with something stronger, trust. She reached out and took his hand and pulled him close and placed his hand on her stomach again. The glow returned and the warmth spread through his fingers like sunlight after a storm. The ground outside shook and the walls trembled as the enemy ship landed near the edge of the station. Dust fell from the ceiling and the lights flickered, and Jake stood in front of Zara with his weapon raised and his body still. He listened to the sounds, footsteps, 3, maybe 4, moving with speed and skill trained to kill. Zara stood slowly and placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "No die, you live, we live." The door began to open and smoke filled the room, and figures stepped through with armor black as night and weapons aimed at the heart. Jake fired first, and the light from his weapon flashed like lightning, and one of the hunters fell back with a sharp cry. Another rushed forward, and Zara raised her hand and a wave of force pushed him across the room like a leaf in a storm. Jake moved to shield her, and together they stood, man and alien, not as soldier and stranger, but as one. And deep inside her, the life they made began to glow. Smoke covered the floor like a blanket made of shadow, and the red emergency light blinked slowly on the walls of the broken station, as if counting the moments left before everything would end. Jake stood near the doorway with his weapon held tight, and his breath steady while Zara stayed behind him with her back against the wall and her eyes locked on the small monitor that showed movement outside. The enemy ship had landed only a few meters away, and its black surface now pulsed with strange red lights that seemed to breathe like something alive and hungry. The ground trembled again as the second group of hunters stepped out of the ship with armor that hissed with energy and blades that moved like part of their arms. These were not just soldiers, they were elite trackers, trained to end threats that broke the sacred laws of Zara's world. Laws that said no hybrid child should ever live. Zara placed one hand over her stomach and whispered something ancient and soft, and the light under her skin glowed with a slow rhythm like the heartbeat of a sleeping star. Jake looked back at her and she nodded once. No fear, no turning back. First hunter entered the hallway with sharp eyes and faster steps and raised his weapon toward Jake, who fired without pause. The blast hit the hunter's chest and threw him back into the smoke, but more were coming. Jake grabbed Zara's hand and pulled her through the narrow path into the lower section of the station where darkness waited. Like an open mouth, they moved quickly down metal stairs that creaked with every step, past broken rooms filled with wires and old tech, until they reached a chamber with a door marked by strange alien letters glowing faint blue. Zara stepped forward and pressed her hand to the wall, and the door opened with a deep hum. Inside was a forgotten space, a small control room mixed with alien upgrades. A safe place, at least for now. Jake entered and checked the corners, while Zara sealed the door with a wave of her hand. The room lit up slowly, soft lights revealing control panels and a half-active screen that blinked with a message in her language. Zara read it and her face changed. The message was from her people, a silent command: eliminate the hybrid before its power awakens. No exceptions. Jake stood near her and asked what the message said. Zara looked into his eyes and answered with no fear, they will never stop. They fear the child. They fear what we created. Jake walked to the window and watched the ship outside still glowing with slow red pulses and saw more hunters spreading through the forest with scanners in their hands and weapons that could tear stone. He turned back to Zara and asked one question. How powerful is the child? Zara stepped closer and touched his chest with her glowing hand and said, stronger than me, stronger than them, a bridge between our worlds. And they fear what they cannot control. The walls shook again as another blast hit the outer station and dust fell like snow. The hunters had found their path and time was running like a river with no end. Jake looked around the control room and saw a broken turret system on the side wall and wires hanging loose like old roots. He grabbed a tool from the table and began repairing it with quick hands and focused eyes. Zara watched him and felt a strange warmth grow in her chest, not just because of the child, but because of him, because of his will, because of his fight. The system sparked back to life and the screen blinked green. Jake smiled and aimed the turret at the hallway, just as the door behind them shook with the force of a powerful strike. Zara stepped forward and placed her hands on the floor and whispered words that made the room glow. Softly, energy moved from her body into the walls. The air shimmered and a shield rose between them and the door. First hunter reached the entrance and saw the glowing wall and fired. The blast bounced back and struck the side. Sparks flew and the turret opened fire. Jake stood beside Zara with his hand on her back and whispered, we hold here, no one gets past us. We end this. Zara nodded and closed her eyes. Her body rose slightly off the ground. The mark on her hand burned bright and a new sound filled the room, a sound like music, like a song made of stars and fire. A sound that came from within her, not her voice, but the voice of the life inside. The child was awake, not yet born, but already reaching out with power and light and force. Hunters outside paused. One by one they felt the wave, not with ears, but with bone and blood. Fear touched them for the first time. Jake stepped forward with his weapon raised. Zara behind him, glowing like a goddess made of moon and flame, and the battle began not for escape, not for victory, but for the future asterisk. The storm had faded, but the world was still burning, and the sky above. The forest glowed orange with smoke and sparks as Jake and Zara moved through the ashes of battle with slow and tired steps. The ground behind them was marked by fire and broken metal, and the shadows of fallen hunters who now lay still under the trees, like forgotten weapons of a cruel war. Their breath was heavy and their bodies bruised, but they kept moving forward. Through the silence that followed the end of a violent night, the child inside, Zara, glowed brighter now, and each step made her stop and press her hand to her stomach as the energy inside grew stronger, like a sun waiting to rise. Jake stayed close and held her steady with one arm around her and the other gripping the last weapon they had. His eyes scanned the forest for signs of movement, but there was only wind now, only soft leaves falling and the distant cry of birds returning to a broken world. They found shelter near a hill where the earth opened into an old cave, half hidden by vines and stone. Inside, the air was cool and still, and the ground was soft and dry. Zara sat near the back wall and closed her eyes while Jake secured the entrance with broken branches and silent traps he made from wire and instinct. When the work was done, he sat beside her and watched the glow from her skin light up the dark space like moonlight trapped inside a crystal. He reached for her hand and she let him hold it without words. There was no fear now, only truth, only silence that felt full instead of empty. Jake looked at her and spoke slowly with a voice that carried no doubt. "I love you, not because of the child, not because of what we survived, but because of you." Zara opened her eyes and looked at him, and something inside her face softened like ice touched by warmth for the first time. She spoke in soft broken English. "I not know love, not on my world. We learn order, we learn power, but not this." She leaned her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes again, and he felt her breath against his neck like a promise without words. The cave held them like a womb, safe and still. Hours passed, or maybe more, and the sound outside faded until there was nothing but the soft rhythm of two heartbeats, one strong, one growing. Zara woke suddenly and placed both hands on her stomach, and her breath came faster now. Jake sat up and touched her face and asked, "What is happening?" She whispered only one word. Soon the energy inside her was no longer gentle. It was alive and wild and bright. The walls of the cave began to shimmer with the same glow, and the air filled with light that came not from flame, but from the child itself. Jake helped her lie back and gathered soft cloth from his pack and water from the small stream outside. He held her hand and spoke softly while she breathed through the rising waves of pain and light. Outside, the wind changed, and the clouds parted just enough for a beam of starlight to reach the cave. It touched the ground near them, and the light from the child answered in return, like two stars meeting after a long journey. Zara cried out once, not in pain but in release, and then there was silence, not empty, but holy. In her arms, she held a child unlike any other, small and glowing, skin of silver and eyes of deep gold, a heartbeat that echoed both human and alien, a soul that carried the fire of two worlds. Jake looked at the child and felt something inside him break and heal at the same time. He touched the small hand, and the child opened its eyes and smiled, not because it understood, but because it felt. Zara looked at Jake and tears ran down her face, not from sorrow but from joy she had never known. She said, "We not alone, not anymore." They sat together, man, woman, and child, under the glow of new life, but far above the stars were not silent. A signal had escaped the wreck, a silent pulse across the galaxy, a message the child lives somewhere beyond the stars. Others listened, some with fear, some with wonder, but for now in this cave there was only peace and love that crossed all lines, all laws, all blood. The cave was quiet, but the stars above had begun to speak, and the night carried a strange pulse through the air, like the slow breath of something ancient now waking from a long sleep. Jake stood near the entrance with the child wrapped safely against his chest while Zara adjusted the controls on a small panel she had built from the broken pieces of her fallen ship. The signal had already been sent. They knew others were listening, some far away, some already close Ixara turned her head and looked at the child who slept without fear and whose soft skin still glowed with a warmth that no shadow could touch. She walked to Jake and placed her hand gently on his, and the child shifted and reached upward with tiny fingers like he was trying to touch the sky through them. Jake looked into Zara's eyes and for the first time saw not a warrior, not a stranger, but someone who had chosen to become more than her origin, someone who had chosen them. They did not speak. There was no need. The air around them was filled with the heartbeat of the future, and it spoke louder than words ever could. Ship was ready. It was small and fragile, a pod born from what was broken, held together by hope and instinct, but it could flick. Zara opened the hatch and Jake stepped inside holding the child close. She followed and sealed the door behind them. The soft hum of power began to rise from beneath their feet, and the lights above flickered to life one by one, as if waking from a long dream. Pod lifted rocks and leaves pushed away by the silent force that carried them upward through the trees, into the sky, through the clouds, beyond the smoke of the forest and the memory of fire. Earth fell away, not as a place lost, but as a chapter. Close stars stretched around them like rivers of light, and the child opened his eyes for the first time in space. He did not cry. He did not fear. He only looked and smiled. The ship moved through a silent path, guided by Zara's hand and protected by something more than shields or weapons, protected by will, protected by purpose. Ahead, a small blue planet turned slowly under a soft sun, a world untouched, unknown, but waiting. Zara scanned the surface and found signs of life, not cities, not war, just air and water and green hills under endless sky, a place to begin again. Watched as the ship entered the new world's atmosphere and the glow outside turned golden. He held the child and whispered something soft, a promise made in quiet breath that he would protect this life, that he would never let the fire inside them be stolen or dimmed. Ship landed gently near a river that sang through a wide valley. Mountains stood in the distance like ancient guards and flowers bloomed along the water's edge like they had always been waiting for their arrival. Hatch opened and warm air rushed inside carrying the scent of something pure and wild. Jake stepped out first, then Zara, then the child. Together they stood under a new skybirds flew overhead in patterns unknown. Wind touched their skin like a welcome. The world around them did not question who they were. It only opened itself like a page ready to be written. They built a small shelter from the remains of the pod, not perfect, not strong, but enough. Nights came and went. Stars watched in silence, and the child grew. He laughed before he spoke. He ran before he crawled. He touched the trees and they bloomed. He touched the rocks and they hummed. Jake taught him how to use hands. Zara taught him how to use heart. The child listened to both one evening as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned gold. The child stood between them with one hand held in each of theirs. He looked at the stars and said a word they did not teach him, a word neither from Earth nor from Zara's world, a word that felt like a beginning. They asked what it meant, and he only smiled and pointed at the stars, then at his chest, then at them. Jake and Zara looked at each other and knew they would never be alone again. Far beyond the stars, others still searched, still feared, still watched. But here in this new world, in this new life, a human and alien and something beyond both had found peace, not by hiding, not by running, but by choosing to live together. A new world had begun, not in silence, not in shadow, but in light.